My mother-in-law tried to poison my wife against me, so I recorded every conversation and played them at Christmas dinner. I never thought I'd be the guy writing one of these stories, but here we are. Life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them, and mine came in the form of a 5'2" woman with perfectly manicured nails and a smile that could freeze hell over. My wife and I had been married for 3 years when things started getting weird. We'd been together since college, one of those relationships that just clicked from day one. She was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner: kind, funny, ambitious, and she made the best chocolate chip cookies I'd ever tasted. Our life together was pretty solid, or so I thought. The first sign something was off came during one of our regular Sunday dinners at her parents' house. My wife seemed distant, distracted in a way that wasn't like her. She kept glancing at her mother with this expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between confusion and concern. When I asked her about it later in the car, she just shrugged and said her mom had been giving her some advice about marriage. I should have pressed harder, but I figured it was just typical mother-daughter stuff. Looking back, that was my first mistake. Over the next few weeks, these Sunday dinners became increasingly uncomfortable. My mother-in-law would make these subtle comments about how different things were when she was first married, how important it was for women to really know their husbands before making any big decisions. The comments started getting more pointed. She'd mention how some men change after marriage, how they become controlling or manipulative. She'd talk about friends whose husbands had turned out to be completely different people than they'd pretended to be during dating. All of this while shooting me these looks that made my skin crawl. My wife started acting differently at home too. She'd question things she'd never questioned before, like why I preferred to handle our finances or why I liked to know where she was going when she went out with friends. These were normal things we'd discussed and agreed on years ago, but suddenly they were becoming points of tension. The breaking point came about 2 months into this nightmare. My wife came home from lunch with her mother looking like she'd seen a ghost. She sat me down and asked me point blank if I'd ever cheated on her. The question hit me like a punch to the gut because it came out of nowhere, and because the answer was absolutely not. I'd never even considered it. When I asked where this was coming from, she said her mother had some concerns about my behavior lately. Apparently, I'd been acting suspicious, staying late at the office more often, being secretive about my phone. None of this was true, but somehow her mother had convinced her it was. That night, lying in bed next to my wife who was pretending to sleep, I realized I was in a war I didn't even know I was fighting. My mother-in-law was systematically poisoning my wife against me, and I had no idea why or how to stop it. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I bought a small digital recorder, the kind that's barely bigger than a USB drive. I started carrying it everywhere, especially to family gatherings. I know it sounds paranoid, but I needed proof of what was happening because my wife wasn't hearing it the way I was. The first recording I got was during a barbecue at their house. My wife had gone inside to help with something, and my mother-in-law immediately started in on me. She told me she knew what kind of man I really was, that she'd seen my type before. She said I was manipulating her daughter, isolating her from her family, and that she wouldn't stand for it. I kept my cool and asked her what she meant, playing dumb. She laid out this whole theory about how I was a classic controller, how I'd gradually isolated my wife from her friends and family, how I was financially controlling her. It was all complete fiction, but she delivered it with such conviction that I started wondering if I was losing my mind. The recordings kept coming. During a shopping trip where I waited in the car while they went into a store, I left the recorder in my wife's purse. The conversation I captured was devastating. My mother-in-law spent 45 minutes telling my wife about warning signs of emotional abuse, about how abusers always seem perfect at first, about how I was probably already cheating or would be soon. She told my wife stories about her friend's daughter whose husband had seemed wonderful until he suddenly changed after marriage. She described behaviors that sounded exactly like normal husband stuff, but framed them as red flags. She even suggested that my wife start keeping track of my whereabouts and check my phone when I wasn't looking. The worst part was hearing my wife's responses. She was starting to believe it. She asked questions about things I'd said or done, and her mother would twist them into evidence of my supposed true nature. By the end of that conversation, my wife was crying and thanking her mother for opening her eyes. I felt sick listening to it. This woman was destroying my marriage with lies, and she was doing it so skillfully that my wife was grateful for it. I had hours of recordings now, all of them showing a clear pattern of manipulation and poison being dripped into my wife's ear. The situation at home was getting worse. My wife was distant, suspicious, and started asking me weird questions about my past relationships and my views on marriage. She'd check my phone when she thought I wasn't looking, and she started making excuses to avoid spending time alone with me. I knew I had to do something, but I also knew that if I just told my wife about the recordings, she'd think I was trying to manipulate her against her mother. Her mother had already planted seeds about how abusive men try to isolate their victims from family. If I came across as trying to turn her against her mother, it would just confirm everything she'd been told. That's when I came up with the plan. Christmas was coming up, and like every year, we'd be having dinner at her parents' house. The whole extended family would be there, her siblings, their spouses, her grandparents, aunts, uncles, everyone. If I was going to expose what was happening, I needed witnesses who couldn't be manipulated or dismissed. I spent weeks preparing. I edited the recordings down to the most damning excerpts, the ones where her mother's manipulation was most obvious. I burned them onto a CD and wrote up a timeline of everything that had happened. I even prepared a speech explaining why I'd recorded the conversations and why I felt I had no choice but to share them. The night before Christmas, I barely slept. I kept thinking about what would happen the next day, how it would destroy my wife's relationship with her mother, how it might destroy my marriage too. But I also knew that if I didn't do something, my marriage was going to die a slow death anyway. Christmas morning started normally enough. We opened presents, had breakfast, and headed over to her parents' house. I had the CD in my pocket, and my hand kept going to it like a talisman. My wife seemed happier than she'd been in months, probably because she thought she was finally seeing me clearly thanks to her mother's guidance. The family dinner was everything you'd expect from a big family Christmas. Kids running around, adults catching up, too much food, and that warm chaos that comes with having 20 people crammed into a house designed for 5. I waited until after dinner, when everyone was relaxed, and settled in the living room with coffee and dessert. I stood up and asked for everyone's attention. I said I had something important to share with the family, something that affected all of us. My wife looked confused, and my mother-in-law had this expression of mild interest that didn't quite hide the wariness in her eyes. I explained that over the past few months, I'd become aware of some conversations that had been happening behind my back, conversations that were affecting my marriage and my relationship with the family. I said I'd made the difficult decision to record these conversations because I felt like I was being gaslit and needed proof of what was really happening. The room got very quiet. My wife was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. Her mother was maintaining her composure, but I could see the panic starting to creep in around the edges. I walked over to the stereo system and put in the CD. I'd organized the recordings chronologically, starting with the milder comments and building up to the more vicious ones. As the first conversation started playing, you could have heard a pin drop in that room. The first recording was my mother-in-law telling my wife that I seemed different lately, more controlling, more suspicious. Hearing her own voice coming through the speakers, she went pale. My wife looked back and forth between us, clearly trying to process what was happening. As the recordings continued, the manipulation became more and more obvious. You could hear my mother-in-law systematically planting doubts about me, telling outright lies about my behavior, and coaching my wife on how to spy on me. The family was listening with expressions of growing shock and disgust. The most damning recording was one where my mother-in-law admitted that she'd never liked me, that she'd always thought her daughter could do better, and that she was determined to make sure my wife saw me for what I really was. She talked about how easy it was to plant seeds of doubt, how she'd done it with her other daughter's first husband too. That last part was news to everyone, including my wife's sister, who was sitting there with her mouth hanging open. Apparently, her mother had pulled the same stunt with her first marriage, contributing to a divorce that had devastated her daughter. When the recordings finished, the silence in the room was deafening. My wife was crying, her sister was crying, and her mother was sitting there like a statue, probably calculating how much damage control she'd need to do. My father-in-law was the first to speak. He looked at his wife with an expression of complete bewilderment and asked her what the hell she thought she was doing. He said he'd noticed the tension between us but had assumed it was normal family adjustment stuff, not active sabotage. The confrontation that followed was brutal. My wife's siblings were furious, especially her sister, who realized that her mother had helped destroy her first marriage. Her grandparents were shocked and disappointed. Even her young cousins seemed to understand that something terrible had happened. My mother-in-law tried to defend herself, claiming she was just trying to protect her daughter, that she'd seen warning signs that others had missed. But the recordings made it clear that she'd been manufacturing those warning signs out of nothing. She'd been lying, manipulating, and orchestrating drama for her own twisted satisfaction. The family turned on her completely. Her own husband was the harshest, saying he was ashamed of her behavior and couldn't believe she'd tried to destroy her daughter's marriage. He said he'd always known she was controlling, but he'd never imagined she was capable of this level of manipulation. My wife was devastated. She kept apologizing to me, saying she didn't understand how she'd been so blind, how she'd let her mother poison her against me. She was angry at herself for believing the lies, angry at her mother for telling them, and angry at the situation for existing at all. The aftermath was messy, as you'd expect. My wife cut contact with her mother completely, which was painful but necessary. Her father divorced her mother 6 months later, saying he couldn't stay married to someone capable of such calculated cruelty. The family essentially ostracized her, and she ended up moving to another state to live with her sister. My wife and I went through a rough patch as we rebuilt trust and worked through the damage that had been done. It took months of difficult conversations and patience on both our parts, but we came out stronger on the other side. She had to learn to trust her own judgment again, and I had to learn to forgive the doubts she'd had about me. The strangest part of the whole experience was discovering that my mother-in-law had done this before. Not just with my wife's sister, but apparently with other family members too. She had a pattern of creating drama and manipulating situations to maintain control over her family. Everyone had just accepted it as her personality, not realizing how destructive it actually was. Looking back, I don't regret recording those conversations or playing them at Christmas dinner. It was a nuclear option, sure, but sometimes nuclear options are the only way to deal with nuclear problems. My marriage was being destroyed by lies and manipulation, and I had to fight fire with fire. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones capable of hurting you the worst. My mother-in-law genuinely believed she was protecting her daughter, but she was actually destroying her happiness. It also taught me that truth has a way of coming out, even when it's buried under layers of manipulation and lies. My wife and I are still married 5 years later. We have 2 kids now, and we've built a life that's stronger because we went through that hell together. She's a different person than she was before, more confident in her own judgment, less willing to let others influence her decisions. I'm different too, more aware of the subtle ways people can manipulate and control others. We still talk about that Christmas sometimes, about how surreal it was to watch a family implode in real time. My wife says it was the worst and best thing that ever happened to her. Worst because she had to face the truth about her mother. Best because it freed her from a lifetime of manipulation she hadn't even realized was happening. The family has mostly healed, though there are still some awkward moments at gatherings. My wife's sister remarried, and she's much happier now that she understands what really happened to her first marriage. My father-in-law is dating someone new, a woman who treats him with respect and doesn't try to control every aspect of his life. As for my former mother-in-law, I have no idea what she's doing now. She tried to reach out a few times over the years, claiming she wanted to apologize and make things right. But the family has collectively decided that some bridges are too burned to rebuild. Some actions are too destructive to forgive, even when they come from family. The whole experience changed how I think about family dynamics and the ways people can hurt each other while claiming to help. It made me more aware of manipulation tactics and more protective of my own family's boundaries. Most importantly, it taught me that sometimes fighting for your marriage means fighting against people who claim to have your best interests at heart. If I had to do it all over again, I'd probably handle some things differently. Maybe I would have confronted my mother-in-law privately first, or tried to have a conversation with my wife about what was happening before it got so bad. But I don't regret the core decision to record those conversations and expose the truth. Sometimes the truth is ugly, but it's still better than living a lie. The recordings are still somewhere in my desk drawer, though I haven't listened to them in years. They're a reminder of one of the darkest periods of my marriage, but also of how we survived it together. They remind me that love isn't always enough to protect a relationship. Sometimes you need courage too, and sometimes you need to be willing to burn everything down to save what matters most.